You are about to discover something that will fundamentally change how you experience life, not through willpower or suppression, but through understanding and transformation. The science is clear, and the evidence overwhelming. Emotional reactivity is not your destiny. Your brain can be rewired, your default responses can be changed, and the person you become through this process will barely recognize the person you are now. Think about the last time someone made you angry. Maybe it was yesterday. Maybe it was an hour ago. Maybe it's happening right now as you read this. That surge of heat in your chest, the tightness in your jaw, the flood of thoughts about what you should say or do. In that moment, it felt like they made you angry, like you had no choice, like the anger just happened to you. But here's what actually occurred in your brain during that moment. Your amygdala, a small almond-shaped structure deep in your temporal lobe, detected what it interpreted as a threat. Not a physical threat necessarily, but a threat to your ego, your expectations, your sense of control. This detection happened in 0.85 milliseconds, less than 1,000th of a second, faster than you could possibly be aware of, faster than conscious thought. The amygdala then sent an alarm signal throughout your entire nervous system. Your hypothalamus activated the stress response. Adrenaline flooded your bloodstream. Cortisol surged, your heart rate spiked, blood pressure rose, muscles tensed, breathing accelerated. Blood flow shifted away from your prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of your brain, and toward your limbs for fighting or fleeing. All of this happened automatically, below the level of awareness, driven by neural circuits that evolved millions of years ago to keep you alive. By the time you became consciously aware that you were angry, your body had already been hijacked. The rational thinking part of your brain came online seconds later, trying to make sense of what was happening. And here's the critical part. Your conscious mind created a story to explain the anger. It said this person made you angry. They disrespected you. They wronged you. They deserve your anger. But this story is backwards. The anger came first, triggered automatically by ancient survival circuits. The story came later, constructed by your conscious mind to justify what your body was already doing. This is why anger feels so certain, so righteous, so justified in the moment. Your brain is designed to create coherent narratives. And once the anger is activated, your mind will find reasons why it makes perfect sense. Now here's the truly transformative insight. If anger is constructed by your brain based on how it interprets situations, then you can learn to construct different responses. This isn't about suppressing anger or pretending you don't feel it. This is about fundamentally changing how your brain processes potentially anger-inducing situations so that anger simply doesn't arise in the first place. The research from neuroscience, psychology, and contemplative traditions all points to the same truth. The person who never gets angry isn't born that way. They weren't blessed with some special genetic mutation. They didn't grow up in a perfect environment. They learned how to work with their mind and nervous system. They understood the mechanics of emotional reactivity. They practiced specific techniques consistently over time, and their brain rewired itself. This rewiring is called neuroplasticity, and it's one of the most significant discoveries in modern neuroscience. Your brain is not fixed. The neural pathways that currently produce anger when certain triggers occur can be weakened through disuse. New neural pathways that produce calm, thoughtful responses can be strengthened through practice. The neurons that fire together wire together, and the neurons that fire apart wire apart. Studies using brain imaging technology have shown this happening in real time. After just 8 weeks of consistent mindfulness practice, researchers can see measurable changes in brain structure. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for emotional regulation, becomes thicker and more active. The amygdala, responsible for threat detection and emotional reactivity, actually shrinks in volume and becomes less reactive. These aren't subjective reports about feeling better. These are objective measurements of physical changes in the brain. But ancient wisdom traditions discovered these principles thousands of years before we had brain scanners. Stoic philosophers in ancient Greece and Rome taught that external events don't cause our emotions. Our judgments about events cause our emotions. Buddhist monks in ancient India taught that suffering comes from attachment and that equanimity can be cultivated through practice. Taoist sages in ancient China taught the principle of Wu Wei, effortless action that flows with circumstances rather than resisting them. These teachings, developed independently across different cultures and time periods, all arrived at the same fundamental insight. You have far more control over your emotional experience than you think. Not control through force or suppression, but control through understanding and skillful practice. The modern therapeutic approaches validate and extend these ancient insights. Cognitive behavioral therapy shows that changing your thoughts changes your emotions. Acceptance and commitment therapy teaches that psychological flexibility, the ability to be present with difficult emotions without being controlled by them, is the key to well-being. Dialectical behavior therapy provides specific skills for regulating intense emotions in the moment. But here's what most people miss. Techniques alone aren't enough. You can learn breathing exercises and cognitive reframing and mindfulness meditation, and these will help in the moment. But lasting transformation requires something deeper. It requires changing at the identity level. It requires becoming a different person. The person who struggles with anger has a certain story about themselves. Maybe it's that they're hot-tempered. Maybe it's that they don't take disrespect from anyone. Maybe it's that they're passionate and intense. These stories feel like facts, like descriptions of who they are, but they're actually narratives that can be edited. The person who never gets angry has a different story. They see themselves as calm, as measured, as someone who responds rather than reacts. They see challenging situations as opportunities to practice rather than threats to defend against. They see other people's behavior as information about those people rather than attacks on themselves. And because they hold this identity, their brain constructs experiences that confirm it. This is the journey you're about to undertake. Not learning tricks to manage your anger, but transforming into someone for whom anger rarely arises. Someone who can remain calm in situations that used to trigger you. Someone who can set boundaries without aggression, express needs without defensiveness, and navigate conflict without losing their center. The path requires understanding at multiple levels. You need to understand the neuroscience so you know what's happening in your brain. You need to understand the psychology so you know what's happening in your mind. You need to understand the root causes so you can address the real issues rather than just symptoms. You need practical techniques you can use in the moment. You need communication strategies for dealing with difficult people. And you need a framework for long-term transformation that makes the changes permanent. This comprehensive guide will take you through all of these levels. We'll start with the science of anger, understanding exactly what happens in your brain and body when you get triggered. We'll explore the psychological dynamics, the hidden emotions beneath anger, the role of expectations and ego threats. We'll learn from ancient wisdom traditions that have been teaching emotional mastery for millennia. We'll examine modern therapeutic approaches with proven effectiveness. Then we'll get practical. You'll learn specific techniques for interrupting anger in the moment, breathing exercises that can calm your nervous system in seconds, mental frameworks that create space between trigger and reaction, communication strategies that let you express yourself clearly without escalating conflict, ways to set boundaries that protect you without requiring anger. We'll address real-world scenarios, dealing with difficult coworker, managing family conflicts, responding to criticism, handling disrespect. You'll learn what to do when someone cuts you off in traffic, when your partner forgets something important, when your boss criticizes your work unfairly, when a family member crosses a boundary. And finally, we'll focus on long-term transformation, how to build emotional resilience, how to change at the identity level, how to create sustainable practices that compound over time, how to measure progress, how to handle setbacks with self-compassion rather than self-criticism, How to become the kind of person for whom calm is the default state. The research is clear on how long this takes. Initial changes can happen within days as you learn new techniques. New habits start forming within weeks as you practice consistently. Brain structure begins changing after about 8 weeks of regular practice. Trait level changes, where your default responses shift, typically emerge within 3 to 6 months. Full identity level transformation, where you genuinely become a different person, usually takes 6 to 12 months of consistent practice. This might sound like a long time, but consider this. How long have you struggled with anger? How many relationships has it damaged? How many opportunities has it cost you? How much peace has it stolen from your life? 6 to 12 months of focused practice to fundamentally solve this problem forever seems like a small investment compared to years or decades of continued struggle. And the process isn't grim or difficult. Each small step forward feels good. Each time you successfully remain calm in a situation that used to trigger you, you feel powerful. Each time you set a boundary clearly without anger, you feel proud. Each time you choose a thoughtful response over an automatic reaction, you're casting a vote for the person you're becoming. These votes accumulate. The person emerges. You don't need to be perfect. You don't need to never feel angry, ever again. The goal isn't to become some emotionless robot. Anger is a natural human emotion with an important function. It signals that a boundary has been violated or a need isn't being met. The transformation is learning to work with anger rather than being controlled by it, to use its information without being hijacked by its energy, to respond skillfully rather than reacting automatically. Some people reading this might think it sounds too good to be true. Maybe you've struggled with anger your whole life. Maybe you've tried anger management classes that didn't help. Maybe you've been told you just have a bad temper and that's just who you are. Maybe you've resigned yourself to the idea that this is something you'll struggle with forever. But the science doesn't lie. The brain changes. Neural pathways rewire. People transform. It happens every day in research labs and therapy offices and meditation centers around the world. Regular people with serious anger problems become people who rarely get angry. It's not magic. It's not a miracle. It's applied neuroscience and psychology. It's consistent practice of proven techniques. It's understanding and skillful effort. The only question is whether you're willing to do the work. Not because the work is hard, but because it requires consistency. 5 minutes of daily practice beats an occasional hour-long session. Small daily choices matter more than occasional dramatic efforts. This is a marathon, not a sprint. But it's a marathon where every mile makes you stronger. Every step feels better than the last, and the destination is a version of yourself you'll be proud to be. So, let's begin. Let's understand what anger actually is, where it comes from, why it hijacks you, and most importantly, how to transform your relationship with it completely. By the end of this journey, you won't just know how to manage anger. You'll be someone who barely experiences it, someone who remains calm under pressure, someone who responds thoughtfully to challenges, someone who never lets other people's behavior control your emotional state. That person already exists inside you. They're just waiting to be developed through understanding and practice. Let's meet them. The hidden architecture of anger. What your brain does in milliseconds. To change your anger response, you first need to understand what's actually happening in your brain when someone triggers you. This isn't just interesting neuroscience trivia. This is essential knowledge that will change how you relate to anger forever. Because once you understand the mechanics, you realize that anger isn't a character flaw or personality trait. It's a neurological process, and neurological processes can be modified. Your brain has 2 pathways for processing emotional information, often called the low road and the high road. These were discovered by neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux through decades of research on fear and emotion. Understanding these pathways is absolutely critical for anger mastery because they explain why anger feels like it happens to you, and they reveal exactly where you can intervene to change the process. The low road is fast, terrifyingly fast. When sensory information comes into your brain through your eyes, ears, or other senses, it first travels to a structure called the thalamus. Think of the thalamus as a relay station that distributes incoming information to different parts of the brain. From the thalamus, information can take two routes. The low road goes directly from the thalamus to the amygdala. This pathway covers the distance in approximately 0.85 milliseconds, less than 1,000th of a second. The amygdala is an almond-shaped cluster of nuclei buried deep in your temporal lobe, and its primary function is threat detection. It's constantly scanning for danger, and when it detects something threatening, it triggers an immediate defensive response. The amygdala doesn't think. It doesn't reason. It doesn't consider context or weigh options. It just reacts based on pattern matching with past experiences. If the current situation resembles something that was threatening in the past, the amygdala sounds the alarm. And once that alarm sounds, a cascade of automatic processes begins. The amygdala sends signals to the hypothalamus, which controls the autonomic nervous system. The hypothalamus activates the sympathetic branch, triggering the fight-or-flight response. The adrenal glands release adrenaline and noradrenaline into your bloodstream. These hormones create immediate physical changes throughout your body. Your heart starts beating faster to pump more blood to your muscles. Your breathing becomes more rapid and shallow to get more oxygen. Your blood pressure rises to increase blood flow. Your muscles tense, preparing for action. Your pupils dilate to let in more light. Digestion shuts down because it's not needed for immediate survival. Blood flow shifts away from your prefrontal cortex, the rational thinking part of your brain, and toward your limbic system and muscles. You're being prepared to fight or run away. At the same time, the hypothalamus triggers the release of cortisol from the adrenal cortex. Cortisol is often called the stress hormone, and it serves important functions. It releases stored glucose for energy. It sharpens focus. It enhances memory formation of the threatening event. But cortisol also has a crucial effect on the brain. It suppresses activity in the prefrontal cortex while enhancing activity in the amygdala. This creates a vicious cycle. The amygdala gets more reactive while the brain region that could calm it down gets less active. You become more sensitive to threats and less able to think clearly about them. This is why, when you're angry, everything feels more threatening. Your colleague's neutral comment sounds like an attack. Your partner's question feels like criticism. Your friend's advice seems like judgment. The amygdala is running the show, and it interprets everything as a potential threat. Now, let's talk about the high road. This is the slower, more careful pathway. From the thalamus, sensory information travels to the sensory cortex for detailed processing. Then it goes to the associative cortex, where context is considered and meaning is assigned. Finally, it reaches the prefrontal cortex, where rational evaluation happens. This entire journey takes several seconds, maybe 5 or 6 seconds, which feels like an eternity compared to the low road's millisecond. The prefrontal cortex is your brain's executive center. It's responsible for planning, decision-making, impulse control, emotional regulation, and rational thought. When the prefrontal cortex is online and functioning well, it can send inhibitory signals to the amygdala that essentially say, "Hey, calm down. This isn't actually dangerous. We don't need the fight or flight response here." This inhibitory pathway is crucial for emotional regulation. In people with good anger control, you see strong connectivity between the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. The prefrontal cortex acts like a brake on emotional reactivity. When anger starts to rise, the prefrontal cortex engages and brings it back down before it reaches the point of explosive action. But here's the critical problem. By the time the high road delivers its careful, rational analysis, The low road has already activated the fight or flight response. The body is already flooded with adrenaline and cortisol. The muscles are already tense. The heart is already racing, and blood flow has already shifted away from the prefrontal cortex itself, making rational thought more difficult. This is why anger feels so overwhelming. It's not that you're weak-willed or out of control. It's that your body has been hijacked by survival circuits that evolved over millions of years, when immediate physical reactions actually kept you alive. When an ancient human encountered a predator or rival threatening their survival, the amygdala's instant response was adaptive. There wasn't time for careful deliberation. React now, think later, or you might not survive to think at all. But modern life doesn't present many genuine physical threats. Most of the things that trigger your amygdala aren't actually dangerous. Your boss criticizing your work won't kill you. Your spouse forgetting an anniversary won't kill you. Someone cutting you off in traffic won't kill you. But your amygdala doesn't know that. It's using pattern matching from past experiences. And if criticism felt threatening as a child, it will continue to feel threatening as an adult. Research by Doherty and colleagues in 2004 revealed something fascinating about people prone to anger attacks. Using brain imaging, they found that when these individuals were provoked, their orbital frontal cortex failed to activate normally. The orbital frontal cortex is part of the prefrontal region responsible for impulse control and emotion regulation. At the same time, their amygdala showed excessive activity. This pattern, excessive bottom-up emotional signals with insufficient top-down control, is the neural signature of reactive aggression. The brake isn't working while the accelerator is floored. More recent research by Tonnerre and colleagues found that after anger provocation, people with reactive aggression show decreased connectivity between the amygdala and medial prefrontal cortex. The communication channel that should allow the prefrontal cortex to calm the amygdala is weakened. But they also found increased connectivity between the amygdala and other limbic structures. The amygdala is talking more to other emotional centers and less to rational control centers. The emotion network amplifies itself while the regulation network fails to engage. Understanding this pattern is empowering because it reveals exactly what needs to change. Strengthen prefrontal amygdala connectivity and improve the brain's ability to activate the regulatory pathway. Now let's talk about the neurochemistry of anger. Multiple neurotransmitter and hormone systems are involved, and understanding them helps explain why anger feels the way it does, and why it can linger long after the trigger is gone. Adrenaline and noradrenaline create the immediate rush of anger. These are the hormones responsible for increased heart rate, blood pressure, sweating, trembling, and that feeling of energy coursing through your body. They're released within seconds of the amygdala's alarm and prepare you for intense physical action. The effects peak within a few minutes, but can last up to an hour, even after the stressor is removed. This is why you feel shaky and restless after getting angry, and why it's hard to calm down immediately. Cortisol follows a similar timeline, but lasts even longer. It can remain elevated for hours after an anger episode. Chronic anger keeps cortisol consistently high, which creates a state of hypervigilance. You're constantly on edge, constantly scanning for threats, constantly ready to react. This is why people who are chronically angry seem to have a hair-trigger temper. Their system is already primed for threat response. It doesn't take much to push them over the edge, because they're always close to the edge. Serotonin is particularly important for understanding anger proneness. Serotonin is often called the feel-good neurotransmitter, but it's more accurate to think of it as a mood stabilizer and impulse regulator. Research shows that low serotonin levels in the prefrontal cortex are associated with increased aggression and reduced impulse control. When serotonin is low, the prefrontal cortex struggles to regulate the amygdala. Testosterone often gets blamed for anger and aggression, but the relationship is more complex than popular belief suggests. Testosterone alone doesn't cause anger. However, testosterone interacts with serotonin systems. When serotonin is normal, testosterone doesn't increase aggression. But when serotonin is low, Testosterone can amplify aggressive tendencies. The key factor isn't testosterone level, but the balance between testosterone and serotonin. Dopamine plays an interesting role in anger as well. Dopamine is involved in reward and motivation circuits. Some research suggests that for certain individuals, anger can become reinforcing. The surge of energy, the sense of power, the feeling of being right and justified, these can activate dopamine circuits, making anger feel good in a twisted way. This helps explain why some people seem almost addicted to their anger, seeking out reasons to feel outraged. Now here's where things get really interesting, and this is where hope enters the picture. Everything I've just described about neural pathways and neurotransmitter systems can be changed through a process called neuroplasticity. Your brain is not fixed. The circuits that currently produce anger can be weakened. New circuits that produce calm can be strengthened. And this isn't theoretical. We can measure it happening. Neuroplasticity research has exploded in the last few decades, completely overturning the old belief that adult brains are unchangeable. We now know that the brain continuously reorganizes itself by forming new neural connections throughout life. Every time you practice a new skill, every time you have a new thought, every time you choose a different response, you're physically changing your brain. The principle is simple. Neurons that fire together, wire together. When you repeatedly activate a particular neural pathway, the connections between those neurons strengthen. The pathway becomes more efficient, more automatic. Conversely, when you stop using a pathway, those connections weaken and eventually prune away. Use it or lose it. Applies to neural circuits just like muscles. This means that every time your amygdala fires and you react with anger, you're strengthening that pathway. You're making it easier for anger to arise next time. But every time your amygdala fires and you engage your prefrontal cortex to respond calmly instead, you're strengthening that pathway. You're making calm response more automatic. Research on mindfulness meditation provides clear evidence of this process. Studies using MRI scans show that after just 8 weeks of regular mindfulness practice, the prefrontal cortex increases in thickness and gray matter density. At the same time, the amygdala decreases in volume and shows reduced reactivity. These aren't subtle changes visible only to sophisticated analysis. They're measurable structural alterations in brain anatomy. Even more impressive, long-term meditators show trait-level changes in emotional reactivity. Their amygdala doesn't just react less during meditation. It reacts less all the time, even when they're not meditating. The changes have become permanent features of how their brain operates. They've literally built a different brain through practice. Research on habit formation shows that new patterns can begin forming in as little as 21 days with consistent practice. More complex habits and behavioral changes typically take 66 days on average before they become automatic, though the range varies from 18 to 254 days depending on the complexity of the behavior and individual differences. The key finding is this: brain changes follow behavioral changes. You don't need to wait until your brain changes to start behaving differently. You start behaving differently consistently, and the brain changes follow. The structure follows the function. The neuroplasticity enables the behavioral change to become increasingly automatic and effortless over time. This is profoundly hopeful. It means that no matter how reactive you currently are, no matter how easily triggered you currently feel, no matter how long you've struggled with anger, your brain can change. The pathways can be rewired. The person you are now doesn't have to be the person you remain. Change is not only possible, but highly probable with the right understanding and consistent practice. But here's what most people get wrong. They think they need to eliminate the amygdala response. They think the goal is to stop that initial 0.85 millisecond activation. That's not possible and not desirable. The amygdala is doing its job of detecting potential threats. The issue isn't the initial activation. The issue is what happens next. The transformation happens in the space between activation and action. That space might initially be just a few seconds. With practice, that space gets longer and more clear. You become aware that anger is arising before you're fully swept into it. You notice the physical sensations, the racing thoughts, the urge to react. And in that noticing, you have choice. This is the sacred pause that Buddhist practitioners talk about. This is the space where freedom lives. In that space, you can engage your prefrontal cortex. You can take a breath. You can remember your values. You can choose a response aligned with who you want to be, rather than automatically enacting the pattern your amygdala suggests. And every time you do this, you strengthen the regulatory pathway. You build the neural infrastructure for emotional mastery. Understanding all of this changes your relationship with anger immediately. You realize anger isn't you. It's not your character or personality. It's a neurological process triggered by perceived threats. The fact that it arises automatically doesn't mean you have to act on it automatically. The fact that your brain generates angry thoughts doesn't mean those thoughts are true or that you have to believe them. You also understand why anger feels so justified in the moment. Your amygdala has detected a threat. Your body has mobilized for fight or flight. Your cortisol-flooded brain is in a state of hypervigilance. Your conscious mind, trying to make sense of all this physiological activation, creates a story about why this person or situation deserves your anger. The story feels absolutely true because your entire nervous system is aligned with it. But when you understand the neuroscience, you can recognize this process happening. You can notice, my amygdala has been triggered. My body is in fight or flight. My mind is generating a threat narrative. This is the anger process unfolding. That simple recognition creates distance. You're no longer identified with the anger. You're aware of the anger as a process happening within you. This is metacognitive awareness. The ability to think about your thinking and observe your emotions as objects of awareness rather than being swept into them. And this metacognitive awareness is itself a function of the prefrontal cortex. When you notice that you're angry, the prefrontal cortex is engaging. When you recognize the process, the prefrontal cortex is engaging. That engagement is the beginning of regulation. The neuroscience reveals both why anger is so challenging and why transformation is possible. It's challenging because you're working against millions of years of evolutionary programming designed to keep you alive through instant reaction to threats. But it's possible because your brain is plastic, changeable, and responds to consistent practice by physically restructuring itself. The question isn't whether your brain can change. The question is whether you're willing to do the practices that change it. Are you willing to interrupt automatic patterns repeatedly until new patterns form? Are you willing to engage your prefrontal cortex when your amygdala wants to take over? Are you willing to sit with the discomfort of not reacting when your entire nervous system is pushing you to react? If you are, then the transformation is inevitable. Not overnight, not magically, but steadily, measurably, inevitably. The neuroscience guarantees it. Your brain will rewire itself in response to how you use it. The only question is what you choose to wire it for: automatic reactivity or thoughtful response. The choice is yours, and it's made new in each moment. What lies beneath? The hidden psychology of your anger. The anger you feel in any given moment is almost never about what it appears to be about. This is one of the most important insights from decades of psychological research, and it's something that people who master their anger understand deeply. Visible anger is just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the surface lie layers of more vulnerable emotions that feel threatening to experience directly. So anger becomes the protective layer, the guard at the gate. Let me give you a concrete example. Your romantic partner forgets your birthday. You feel furious. You lash out at them. In the moment, the anger feels completely about their forgetfulness. They should have remembered. They don't care about you enough. They're selfish and inconsiderate. The anger narrative is simple and clear. They wronged you. Anger is the appropriate response. But underneath the anger, what's really there? Hurt. You feel hurt that something important to you wasn't important enough for them to remember. Disappointment. You had expectations about how this day would go, and reality didn't match. Fear. Maybe you fear that their forgetfulness signals waning affection, that you're becoming less important to them. Sadness. You feel sad that this special day isn't special. Shame. Perhaps you feel embarrassed or ashamed that your birthday wasn't important enough to remember. Loneliness. You feel alone in caring about this. All of these emotions, hurt, disappointment, fear, sadness, shame, loneliness, are more vulnerable than anger. They require admitting needs. They require acknowledging that you can be wounded. They put you in a one-down position emotionally. Anger, by contrast, feels powerful. Anger says, "You wronged me. You owe me. You need to fix this." Anger is the emotion that moves outward, that puts the problem on someone else, that makes you feel strong rather than vulnerable. This is why psychologists often call anger a secondary emotion. It's secondary, not in the sense of being less important, but in the sense that it usually appears on top of more primary, vulnerable emotions. The primary emotions are the real issue. The anger is the protective response to those primary emotions. This pattern plays out constantly in daily life, though most people aren't aware of it. Your coworker takes credit for your idea in a meeting. You feel enraged. Beneath the rage, fear that your contributions won't be recognized, anxiety about your job security, powerlessness at the injustice, disappointment in someone you thought was ethical. Your child refuses to clean their room for the 10th time. You explode in anger. Beneath the explosion, exhaustion from feeling like you have to fight every battle, fear that you're failing as a parent, sadness that your relationship with your child involves so much conflict, helplessness at not knowing how to get through to them. The anger iceberg model, developed by therapists working with emotional regulation, illustrates this beautifully. Above the waterline, you see anger, irritation, frustration. This is the 10% that's visible. Below the waterline, hidden from view but making up 90% of the mass, you find hurt, disappointment, fear, embarrassment, sadness, shame, guilt, worry, stress, overwhelm, anxiety, powerlessness, inadequacy, betrayal, rejection, disrespect, humiliation, jealousy, and loneliness. Understanding your personal anger iceberg is transformative. It shifts the question from "why am I so angry?" to "what am I really feeling beneath this anger?" And when you can identify and address the primary emotions, the anger often dissolves on its own. You don't have to manage or suppress it. You heal the wound, and the bandage is no longer needed. Let's talk about expectations, because unmet expectations are one of the most common sources of anger, and most people are completely unaware of how their expectations are constantly setting them up for frustration. An expectation is a belief about how things should be. Your spouse should make coffee without being asked. Your kids should listen the first time. Your colleagues should respond to emails within 24 hours. Traffic should move smoothly. The weather should be nice for your outdoor event. Notice the word should in all of these. Should is the linguistic marker of expectations, and every should represents an assumption of control that you don't actually have. You're assuming that reality should conform to your preferences, but reality operates according to its own principles, not your preferences. Your spouse operates according to their own habits and attention, not your unstated expectations. Your kids operate according to developmental stage and individual temperament, not your ideal of perfect obedience. The gap between expectation and reality is where anger lives. The larger the gap, the more intense the anger. And here's the crucial part. You can't control reality to match your expectations most of the time. What you can control is your expectations. You can make them more realistic. You can communicate them clearly, rather than assuming others should read your mind. You can hold them loosely rather than rigidly. You can recognize them as preferences rather than requirements. Research by David A. and Gilovich on the psychology of expectations found that unmet expectations are one of the primary drivers of life dissatisfaction. Their studies showed that people consistently overestimate what they'll achieve and how situations will unfold, setting themselves up for chronic disappointment. The problem isn't lack of achievement or unfortunate circumstances. The problem is unrealistic expectations that guarantee disappointment. This plays out in relationships constantly. You expect your partner to know what you need without you saying it. When they don't meet that unspoken need, you feel angry. But the expectation that anyone can read your mind is unrealistic. You expect your adult children to visit more often or call more regularly. When they don't, you feel angry. But the expectation that they'll prioritize your preferences over their own lives and commitments may be unrealistic. You expect your friend to support you in a conflict with someone else. When they stay neutral or even support the other person, you feel betrayed and angry. But the expectation that friends will always take your side regardless of the situation may be unrealistic. The solution isn't to have no expectations. Expectations are necessary for planning and coordination, but they need to be explicit, communicated, mutually agreed upon, and held flexibly. When you catch yourself thinking they should have known or they should have done something, stop and question. Did I clearly communicate this expectation? Did they agree to it? Am I assuming powers of mind reading or levels of attention that aren't realistic? Am I confusing my preference with an obligation? Now let's address ego threats, because these are huge triggers for anger, and most people don't recognize them as such. Your ego is your sense of self, your self-concept, your identity. It includes how you see yourself and how you believe others see you. Ego threats are events that challenge this self-concept, that suggest you're not as competent, worthy, intelligent, or good as you believe yourself to be. Research on threatened egotism by Roy Baumeister and colleagues found that people with high but unstable self-esteem are particularly vulnerable to aggressive behavior when their ego is threatened. These are people who have a positive view of themselves, but deep insecurity about whether that positive view is justified. Any challenge to their self-image feels existentially threatening. This explains road rage beautifully. When someone cuts you off in traffic, it's rarely about the actual inconvenience. You might lose 3 seconds. But what does the action communicate? That you're not important enough to respect, that your time doesn't matter, that you can be disregarded. This is an ego threat. Your importance has been challenged. Anger surges to defend your importance, to punish the person who disrespected you, to reassert your significance. The same dynamic appears in response to criticism at work. Your boss points out an error in your report. Objectively, this is useful feedback. But if you have an ego investment in being competent and not making mistakes, the criticism threatens your self-concept. You feel anger at your boss for pointing it out, even though they're helping you. The anger is defending your ego against information that challenges how you see yourself. Narcissistic individuals show extreme versions of this pattern. They rely heavily on external validation for their self-worth and are consequently hypersensitive to any perceived slight, criticism, or lack of recognition. They interpret neutral events as attacks and respond with disproportionate anger. This isn't because they love themselves too much, as popular psychology sometimes suggests. It's because their self-concept is so fragile that it constantly needs defending. But you don't have to meet criteria for narcissistic personality disorder to experience ego-driven anger. We all have ego investments. We all have areas where our self-concept is fragile. Maybe you pride yourself on being a good parent, so when your teenager says you don't understand them, you feel enraged rather than curious. Maybe you identify as intelligent, So when someone points out a mistake in your reasoning, you feel attacked rather than grateful for the correction. Maybe you see yourself as a good person, so when someone calls out harmful behavior, you feel defensive and angry rather than open to growth. The antidote to ego-driven anger is developing what psychologists call a growth mindset about your own capacities and worth. Carol Dweck's research on fixed versus growth mindsets shows that people with fixed mindsets see their qualities as unchangeable. Criticism or failure threatens their identity because it suggests they lack some essential quality. People with growth mindsets see qualities as developable. Criticism or failure becomes information for development rather than evidence of inadequacy. When you can see yourself as a work in progress rather than a finished product that needs defending, ego threats lose much of their power. Mistakes become data points for learning rather than challenges to your worth. Criticism becomes useful feedback rather than attack. Other people's successes become inspiration rather than threats to your adequacy. The defensive anger that protects a fragile ego is no longer necessary when you're not trying to prove you're already perfect. Let's shift to childhood and trauma, because for many people, present moment anger is actually a reenactment of past wounds. The field of attachment theory, developed from the work of John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, reveals how early childhood experiences shape adult emotional patterns. The attachment style you develop in your first relationships with caregivers becomes a template for how you relate to others and regulate emotions throughout life. Secure attachment, formed when caregivers are consistently responsive to a child's needs, creates adults who can regulate emotions well, form healthy relationships, and trust others. But the other attachment styles create vulnerabilities to anger. Anxious ambivalent attachment, formed when caregivers are inconsistent, creates adults who are hypervigilant to signs of rejection or abandonment. They overreact to perceived slights because their nervous system is constantly scanning for the abandonment they experienced in childhood. Small disappointments trigger disproportionate anger because they activate this deep wound. Avoidant attachment, formed when caregivers are neglectful or rejecting, creates adults who suppress emotions and maintain distance in relationships. They seem calm on the surface, but often harbor resentment that builds until it explodes. The anger has been there all along, just pushed underground. Disorganized attachment, formed in abusive or severely unpredictable environments, creates adults who swing between desperate connection and angry pushing away. They simultaneously crave and fear intimacy, and anger becomes a way to create distance when vulnerability feels too threatening. Gabor Mate, a physician who has worked extensively with trauma and addiction, makes a crucial observation about anger repression. In his work with thousands of patients over decades, he found that people with chronic illnesses consistently exhibited emotional shutdown, particularly the paralysis and repression of anger. His research suggests that chronic suppression of anger, the complete inability to express or even feel anger when it's warranted, leads to elevated stress hormones that suppress immune function and create inflammation throughout the body. This is a critical nuance. The goal isn't to be angry all the time or never angry. It's to have access to healthy anger that signals boundary violations or unmet needs, expresses itself appropriately in the moment, and then passes. Chronic suppression is just as problematic as chronic expression. Healthy anger arises, gives you information, perhaps motivates action to address the situation, and then dissolves. Unhealthy anger either explodes destructively or gets swallowed and turns into bodily illness. Bessel van der Kolk's groundbreaking work on trauma reveals how traumatic experiences literally change brain function. In his brain imaging studies of PTSD patients, he found that when trauma survivors recalled traumatic events, their language centers shut down while their visual and emotional centers lit up. This explains why trauma victims often can't articulate what happened to them. They experience speechless horror because the trauma lives in pre-verbal, body-based memory. For trauma survivors, Anger in the present is often a replay of helplessness in the past. The current trigger isn't really the cause. It's just the match that lights a fuse laid down years ago. Your boss's criticism might trigger rage not because of what they said, but because it activates the neural networks formed when you were criticized as a child and had no power to respond. Your partner's late arrival might trigger fury not because of the actual inconvenience, but because it activates abandonment terror from childhood. Pete Walker's work on emotional flashbacks describes this phenomenon beautifully. Unlike regular flashbacks that include memory or images, emotional flashbacks are sudden regressions to overwhelming feeling states from childhood: fear, shame, rage, grief, without realizing you're re-experiencing the past. In the moment, it feels like your anger is about the present situation, but it's actually a child's terror or helplessness in disguise, now expressed as adult rage, because rage feels more powerful than helplessness. The inner critic, that harsh voice in your head that constantly judges and berates you, grows rampantly in traumatized children and continues into adulthood. This critic not only intensifies emotional flashbacks, but eventually begins to trigger them independently. Perfectionism becomes a way to try to avoid the criticism or abandonment you experienced as a child. But the perfectionist standards are impossible to meet, so you're constantly falling short in your own eyes, constantly triggering shame, which you might experience as anger at yourself or displacement of anger onto others. Understanding this trauma dimension of anger is crucial, because it reveals why purely cognitive or behavioral approaches sometimes fail. You can learn all the anger management techniques in the world, but if you're being triggered into flashbacks, those techniques won't work until you address the underlying trauma. The anger isn't really about learning to count to 10. It's about healing wounds that make your nervous system perceive threats everywhere. Let's talk about projection and transference. Psychological defense mechanisms that create anger at phantoms rather than reality. Projection involves attributing your own unacceptable thoughts, feelings, or impulses to others. If you're harboring angry feelings towards someone but those feelings conflict with your self-image, you might unconsciously project them, transforming "I'm angry at them" into "they're angry at me." Carl Jung noted that what you reject or deny in yourself, your shadow, often gets projected onto others. The qualities that most irritate you in other people often reflect qualities you possess, but refuse to acknowledge in yourself. The hypocrisy you see in someone else might reflect ways you're hypocritical, but justified differently. The arrogance that enraged you might reflect your own superiority complex that you've dressed up as something more acceptable. This is why examining your strong emotional reactions to others can be so revealing. When someone triggers disproportionate anger, ask yourself, what quality in them am I reacting to? Do I possess any version of this quality? What would it mean if I did? Am I fighting against something in them because I'm fighting against it in myself? This shadow work, as Jung called it, can dissolve anger that's really about internal conflict being externalized. Transference is related but distinct. Transference involves transferring feelings from one relationship onto another, usually from past relationships onto present ones. If you had a critical parent, you might transfer those parental dynamics onto authority figures, experiencing your boss's feedback as devastating criticism, even when it's mild and constructive. If you had a sibling who always took attention away from you, you might transfer that dynamic onto coworkers, feeling enraged when they receive recognition even though objectively their success doesn't diminish you. The key difference is that projection puts your own qualities onto others, while transference puts old relationship patterns onto new people. But both create anger that isn't really about the present situation. You're angry at a ghost, a memory, a pattern from the past. The person in front of you is just the screen onto which you're projecting an old movie. Recognizing projection and transference requires honest self-examination. When you find yourself thinking everyone is always doing something or nobody ever understands something, that's a clue. The absolutism suggests you're seeing a pattern that might exist more in your perception than in reality. When your emotional reaction seems disproportionate to the actual event, that's a clue. Why does this small thing feel so huge? What might it be reminding you of? When you have the same conflict repeatedly with different people, that's a clue. If the same pattern keeps appearing with different actors, you might be the common denominator, and the pattern might be something you're bringing to situations. Understanding all of these psychological dimensions transforms how you relate to anger. You begin to recognize anger as information. It's telling you something, but what it's telling you is rarely the surface story. When anger arises, instead of immediately acting on it or suppressing it, you can pause and investigate. What am I really feeling beneath this? What expectations are being violated? What ego investment is being threatened? What old wound is being activated? What am I projecting? What am I transferring? This investigation doesn't mean you never express anger or set boundaries. Sometimes anger's information is valid. This boundary has been violated. This need must be communicated. This situation is genuinely unjust and requires action. But even then, understanding the full context allows you to respond more skillfully. You can address the actual issue rather than lashing out from hurt or fear. You can set boundaries firmly without explosion. You can request what you need without blame. The psychological work of anger mastery isn't about elimination. It's about understanding. And through understanding comes choice. Through choice comes power. And through power comes the freedom to respond to life as it is, rather than being controlled by how past experiences have wired you to react. Ancient wisdom meets modern life. What Stoics and Buddhists knew about anger. 2,000 years before neuroscientists could peer inside the brain with imaging technology, ancient philosophers were conducting experiments in consciousness. They didn't have laboratories or control groups, but they had something equally valuable: centuries of careful observation about what makes human beings suffer and what sets them free. And their conclusions about anger are remarkably consistent across cultures and eras. The Roman Stoic philosopher Seneca wrote an entire treatise on anger, called De Ira, in the 1st century. His opening declaration cuts right to the heart. No plague has cost the human race more dear. He saw anger not as a minor character flaw, but as temporary madness, a voluntary insanity that destroys the person who harbors it more than the target it's directed at. Seneca's key teaching is prevention rather than management. Don't try to control anger once it's fully activated, he argues. Resist it at the very beginning. The enemy must be stopped at the very frontier. This aligns perfectly with what neuroscience now shows about the amygdala hijack. If you can catch the process in those first milliseconds before the full cascade activates, you prevent the entire reaction. But once the adrenaline is flooding your system and cortisol has suppressed your prefrontal cortex, rational control becomes extremely difficult. His practical advice includes considering consequences before you act. In the heat of anger, you see only the immediate satisfaction of expressing rage. But Seneca urges you to think ahead. What will this cost you? How will you feel when the anger passes and you see the damage you've done? Is the momentary satisfaction worth the lasting consequences? This is essentially engaging your prefrontal cortex to override the amygdala's impulse. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor who ruled Rome while also practicing Stoicism, developed systematic strategies recorded in his private journal, now known as Meditations. He had every reason to be angry. He faced constant betrayals, military threats, political intrigue, and personal losses. Yet his writings show someone committed to remaining calm and rational, regardless of circumstances. One of his core practices was what he called viewing things from above. When something angered him, he would imagine rising above the situation, seeing himself and the other person as tiny figures in a vast landscape, then rising higher to see the city, then the country, then the world, then the cosmos. From that cosmic perspective, does this slight or offense really matter? Will it matter tomorrow, next year, when you're on your deathbed? This zoom-out technique immediately shifts emotional intensity. Another practice was considering people's whole character, rather than isolated actions. When someone wrongs you, Marcus taught, consider whether they did it knowingly or unknowingly. Consider their background, their struggles, their limited understanding. Consider how many things you yourself do that others could take offense at. This doesn't mean excusing harmful behavior, but it puts it in context that makes personal anger less automatic. His most famous teaching on anger is simple. The best answer to anger is silence. This isn't passive suppression, but strategic non-engagement. When you refuse to add fuel to the fire through angry words or actions, the fire burns out on its own. Silence creates space. Space allows the amygdala activation to pass. Once it passes, the prefrontal cortex comes back online and you can respond thoughtfully. The Stoic practice that's most applicable to daily anger management is the dichotomy of control. Articulated most clearly by Epictetus, he taught that some things are up to us while others are not. What's up to us? Our judgments, our desires, our aversions, our actions. What's not up to us? Other people's actions, outcomes, circumstances, the past, much of the future, the weather, our reputation. Anger arises, Epictetus taught, when we think we control what we don't actually control. You think you control whether your spouse will remember your birthday, so you're angry when they forget. But you don't control their memory or attention. You think you control whether your kids will clean their room, so you're angry when they don't. But you don't control their choices, only your own. You think you control whether traffic will be smooth, so you're angry when it's not. But you have zero control over traffic. The practice is simple but profound. Whenever you feel anger rising, ask yourself, is this situation within my control or outside it? If it's outside your control, getting angry is like being angry at rain for being wet. It's a category error. The thing isn't conforming to your preferences, but it never was going to conform to your preferences because it's not within your control. Accepting this reality immediately dissolves much anger. If the situation is within your control, then you don't need anger. You just need action. If you don't like that your house is messy, clean it. If you don't like your job, change it, or change how you relate to it. If you don't like a dynamic in a relationship, communicate clearly and set boundaries. Anger becomes unnecessary when you focus on what you can actually do. Now let's cross the world to ancient India and Buddhism. The Buddha taught that anger is one of the three poisons that keep beings trapped in suffering, along with greed and delusion. His teaching on anger comes through his analysis of the chain of dependent origination, how suffering arises. Contemplation on objects leads to attachment. You see something desirable or think about something you want. Attachment leads to craving. The casual interest becomes a need, a grasping. Craving leads to clinging. You try to hold on to what you want or push away what you don't want. This clinging creates suffering when reality doesn't match your desires. And from this suffering comes anger. Anger, in Buddhist psychology, is a response to thwarted desire. You want something and don't get it. Anger, you want to avoid something and can't. Anger, someone has something you want. Jealous. Anger, someone interferes with what you want. Frustrated anger, someone doesn't give you what you feel entitled to. Indignant anger. In every case, the underlying structure is the same. Craving plus obstacle equals anger. The Buddhist solution is developing equanimity, called upekkha in Pali. Equanimity is mental equilibrium, balance, evenness, regardless of whether you're experiencing pleasure or pain, gain or loss, praise or blame. This doesn't mean you don't have preferences. You still prefer comfort over pain, but you don't cling to the preference. You remain balanced, whether you get what you prefer or not. The practice of equanimity training involves recognizing that all experiences are temporary. This pleasant feeling will pass. This painful feeling will pass. This person's approval or disapproval will pass. All conditions are impermanent. Clinging to what's pleasant or resisting what's unpleasant is like trying to hold water in your fist. The tighter you squeeze, the faster it flows away. Buddhist meditation practices train equanimity directly. Vipassana meditation, for example, involves observing sensations in the body with complete equanimity, not reacting to pleasant sensations with craving or unpleasant sensations with aversion. You learn to observe intense sensations, whether pleasure or pain, with the same balanced awareness. This trains the mind to remain stable, regardless of what's being experienced. When anger arises, the Buddhist approach is not to suppress it or act on it, but to observe it with mindfulness. Notice anger is arising. Notice the physical sensations, the racing heart, the heat, the tension. Notice the thoughts, the angry narratives and judgments. Notice the urges, the impulse to lash out or say something cutting, and notice all of this without identifying with it. This is the crucial shift. Instead of "I am angry," the recognition becomes "anger is present." The anger is an object of awareness, not your identity. And as you observe it with this non-identified awareness, something remarkable happens. The anger begins to dissolve, not because you're pushing it away, but because you're not feeding it with more thoughts and reactions. You're just watching it, and what you watch with equanimity naturally passes. The sacred pause teaching comes from this tradition. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space lies your freedom. When someone insults you, there's the insult and there's your response. Between them is a gap. Most people never notice the gap because they react so automatically. The insult and the angry response feel like one continuous event, but with training, you become aware of the gap. And in that awareness, you have choice. Let's turn to Taoism and the principle of Wu Wei, often translated as non-action or effortless action. This is one of the most misunderstood concepts in Eastern philosophy. Wu Wei doesn't mean doing nothing. It means action that flows with the nature of things rather than forcing against them. It's the action of water, which accomplishes tremendous effects, carving canyons and shaping stone, yet never forces, never strains, never pushes directly against obstacles. Applied to anger, Wu Wei means not fighting anger with anger. When anger arises and you try to force it down through sheer willpower, you're creating internal conflict. Part of you wants to be angry. Another part is angry at the part that's angry. This internal fighting amplifies the total amount of anger in your system. It's like trying to calm disturbed water by slapping it. Your intervention makes it worse. The Wu Wei approach is acceptance. Anger is arising. This is what's happening right now. Fighting, it won't make it go away faster. Instead, you allow it to be present while not acting on it. You create space for it. This isn't passive resignation. It's active allowing. You're choosing not to add fuel to the fire through internal struggle or external action. And without fuel, the fire naturally dies down. The Tao Te Ching, the foundational Taoist text, teaches that the most flexible thing can overcome the most rigid. Water overcomes stone, not through hardness, but through persistence and flexibility. Applied to interpersonal conflict, this suggests that soft responses can be more effective than hard ones. When someone comes at you with anger, matching their intensity escalates the situation. But responding with calm, with flexibility, with genuine curiosity about their perspective, often de-escalates everything. This is strategic softness, not weakness. You're choosing the response most likely to achieve your actual goals, rather than the response that feels most satisfying to your ego in the moment. Your ego wants to match their intensity, to prove you're not weak, to win the confrontation. But what do you actually want? Usually, you want the situation resolved, the relationship maintained, or at minimum your own peace of mind preserved. Soft responses serve these goals better than hard ones. Moving to the Bhagavad Gita, ancient India's philosophical epic, we find the teaching on the destructive chain of anger. Contemplation on objects leads to attachment. Attachment leads to desire. Desire leads to anger. Anger leads to delusion. Delusion results in loss of memory. Loss of memory destroys intelligence. And when intelligence is destroyed, one is ruined. This chain shows how anger isn't an isolated problem, but part of a cascade that ends in the destruction of clear thinking. When you're angry, you literally can't think straight. Memory becomes unreliable as cortisol floods your system. Intelligence becomes inaccessible as blood flow shifts away from your prefrontal cortex. You say and do things you'll later regret because your capacity for wise judgment has been temporarily destroyed. The Gita's teaching emphasizes self-mastery. The greatest battle isn't with external enemies but with internal reactions. Conquering anger is conquering yourself, and self-conquest comes through understanding the self beyond emotion. The Atman, the true self in Vedantic philosophy, is unchanging awareness beyond all temporary emotional states. When you identify with that deeper self rather than with passing emotions, anger loses its grip. Confucian philosophy approaches anger through the lens of self-cultivation and proper conduct. Confucius taught, when anger rises, think of consequences. This is prefrontal cortex engagement, before the amygdala fully hijacks you. He also taught, attack the evil in yourself, not in others. When something angers you, the question isn't how to punish or change the other person. The question is what this anger reveals about something in you that needs work. Confucian practice involves constant self-examination. At the end of each day, reviewing your actions and reactions. Where did you maintain proper composure? Where did you let anger control you? What can you learn? What can you adjust tomorrow? This daily reflection builds metacognitive awareness that gradually changes behavior. Islamic Sufi traditions, particularly in Rumi's poetry and teaching, view anger as a powerful force that must be bridled and redirected like a wild horse. Rumi writes, anger is a king over kings, but anger once bridled may serve. The energy of anger, when channeled appropriately, can fuel justice, protect boundaries, and motivate necessary change. But unbridled anger destroys everything in its path, starting with the angry person themselves. The Sufi path involves taming the nafs, the ego or lower self that is the source of reactive anger. Through practices of dhikr, remembrance of the divine, through service to others, through cultivating divine love, the nafs is gradually transformed. The goal isn't to have no anger, but to have anger that serves the good, rather than serving the ego's need for dominance. What's remarkable about all these ancient traditions is their convergence, despite independent origins, separated by thousands of miles and years. I'll emphasize prevention over management. I'll focus on root causes rather than symptoms. I'll teach that anger harms the angry person as much or more than the target. I'll provide contemplative practices for developing emotional mastery. I'll point toward the possibility of fundamental transformation rather than just better coping. And modern research validates every single one of these ancient insights. The Stoic dichotomy of control aligns with locus of control research in psychology, showing that people focused on what they can control are happier and less anxious. The Buddhist teaching on impermanence aligns with acceptance-based therapies, showing that accepting reality as it is reduces suffering. The Taoist principle of Wu Wei aligns with research on psychological flexibility, showing that allowing difficult emotions without struggling against them leads to better outcomes. These aren't just beautiful philosophies. They're tested technologies for transforming consciousness, refined over centuries by people as committed to understanding the mind as modern scientists are. The difference is methodology. Scientists use instruments and measurements. Contemplatives use direct observation of their own minds, but both arrive at similar truths. The practical application for you is this: you're not inventing anger management from scratch. You're joining a tradition of practice stretching back thousands of years. Millions of people before you have walked this path from reactivity to responsiveness. The techniques have been tested across cultures, refined through generations, proven effective over and over. You're not hoping it might work. You're implementing methods with the longest track record of success in human history. The practical arsenal. Techniques that work in real time. Understanding the science and philosophy of anger is crucial. But in the moment when someone cuts you off in traffic, or your teenager rolls their eyes at you, or your spouse says something dismissive, you need practical tools that work immediately. You need techniques you can deploy in seconds that interrupt the anger cascade before it hijacks your entire system. Let's start with the most powerful and accessible tool you have, your breath. Breathing is unique among bodily functions because it operates automatically, but can also be controlled consciously. This makes it a bridge between your autonomic nervous system, which runs automatically, and your voluntary control. By changing your breath, you can directly influence your nervous system state. When anger activates, your breathing becomes rapid and shallow, centered in your chest. This is the breathing pattern of fight or flight, designed to get oxygen to muscles quickly for intense action. But this breathing pattern also maintains the stress response. It keeps signaling to your brain, danger, threat, need to stay activated. Deep, slow breathing does the opposite. It activates the vagus nerve, which triggers the parasympathetic nervous system, your rest and digest mode. This directly counteracts the fight or flight response. Heart rate slows, blood pressure drops, muscle tension releases, cortisol levels decrease. The prefrontal cortex comes back online, and crucially, the amygdala reactivity dampens. Box breathing, also called square breathing, is used by Navy SEALs and other special forces for managing stress in extreme situations. The technique is simple. Breathe in for 4 counts, hold for 4 counts, breathe out for 4 counts, hold empty for 4 counts, repeat for several cycles. The equal timing of each phase creates balance. You're neither overstimulating through long inhales nor over-relaxing through long exhales. You're creating centered calmness that's perfect for situations requiring clear thinking under pressure. The 4-7-8 breathing technique, developed by Dr. Andrew Weil, creates particularly strong relaxation effects. Place your tongue behind your upper front teeth. Inhale through your nose for 4 seconds. Hold for 7 seconds. Exhale forcefully through your mouth for 8 seconds, making a whoosh sound. The extended exhale is key. It triggers a strong parasympathetic response that can shift your entire nervous system state in just a few cycles. Perhaps the most powerful technique, supported by recent Stanford research, is the physiological sigh. This is a double inhale through the nose, followed by a long, slow exhale through the mouth. Breathe in deeply through your nose. Then before exhaling, take another smaller sip of air through your nose to top off your lungs. Then release everything slowly through your mouth. The double inhale reinflates collapsed alveoli in your lungs that collapse during stress. The extended exhale increases carbon dioxide in your bloodstream, which triggers receptors that activate your calming system. Research by Andrew Huberman's lab at Stanford found that just 1 to 3 physiological sighs can quickly reduce stress and anxiety. When anger is rising, 2 or 3 physiological sighs can interrupt the activation before it becomes overwhelming. Progressive muscle relaxation, developed by Edmund Jacobson in the 1920s, teaches your body the difference between tension and relaxation. The practice involves systematically tensing and then releasing each muscle group. Start with your feet. Curl your toes tightly for 5 seconds, then release completely for 20 seconds. Notice the difference between tension and relaxation. Move up to calves, thighs, buttocks, abdomen, chest, hands, arms, shoulders, neck, and face. When practiced regularly, maybe twice daily for 15 minutes, progressive muscle relaxation trains you to recognize tension in your body before it escalates. You become aware of jaw clenching, shoulder tightening, or fist making before you're fully activated. This early awareness gives you intervention points. You can release the tension the moment you notice it, preventing the buildup that leads to explosive anger. Vagus nerve stimulation provides another powerful intervention. The vagus nerve is the primary pathway of your parasympathetic system, and there are multiple ways to stimulate it quickly. Cold exposure is one of the most effective. Splash cold water on your face, hold a cold pack to your neck, or even take a quick cold shower. The cold stimulates the vagus nerve and triggers the dive reflex, an ancient mammalian response that immediately slows heart rate. Humming, chanting, or singing also stimulate the vagus nerve because it runs through your vocal cords. When you feel anger rising, humming a tune or chanting a mantra activates this nerve. Self-massage of your neck, shoulders, and feet provides another access point. Gentle to moderate pressure stimulates vagal pathways. Even activities that inspire awe, like looking at vast landscapes or listening to moving music, can activate the vagus nerve. Now let's talk about mental frameworks that complement these physiological techniques. The 6-second rule is based on research showing that the neurochemical peak of anger lasts only about 6 seconds. That initial surge of adrenaline and cortisol hits its peak intensity very quickly, and then starts to subside if you don't re-trigger it with additional angry thoughts. When something triggers you, stop and count slowly to 6. 1 1,000, 2 1,000, 3 1,000, 4 1,000, 5 1,000, 6 1,000. The counting itself occupies your conscious mind, preventing it from spinning angry narratives, and those 6 seconds allow the initial neurochemical peak to pass. By the time you reach 6, the worst of the automatic reaction has subsided, and your prefrontal cortex is coming back online. The stop technique provides a structured way to interrupt reactivity. Stop whatever you're doing or about to do. Take a step back, either literally or mentally, to create distance from the situation. Observe what's happening objectively. What are you feeling physically? What thoughts are arising? What urges do you notice? Proceed mindfully, choosing a response aligned with your values rather than reacting automatically. The "this too shall pass" mindset comes from an ancient Persian fable about a ring inscribed with those words, meant to make a happy person sad and a sad person happy by reminding them of impermanence. Applied to anger, this phrase reminds you that the emotion is temporary. It feels overwhelming right now, but it will pass. All emotions pass like weather. You don't need to act on this temporary state. When anger surges, silently repeating, "This too shall pass," creates perspective. You can even pair it with breathing. This on the inhale, too shall pass on the exhale. The mantra interrupts angry rumination and connects you to the fundamental truth of impermanence. The situation that feels so critical right now will barely register in memory a month from now. The emotion that feels like it will last forever will be gone in minutes if you don't feed it. Zoom out perspective techniques. Shift your viewpoint to see the bigger picture. Imagine floating up above the situation like you're rising in a helicopter. See yourself and the other person from above, two small figures having this interaction. Rise higher until you can see the building, the neighborhood, the city. Rise higher until you see the state, the country, the continent. From this cosmic perspective, does this moment of anger really matter? Another zoom-out technique is the timeline perspective. Will this matter in 10 minutes? Probably yes. You'll still be annoyed. Will it matter in 10 days? Maybe, if it was significant. Will it matter in 10 months? Probably not, unless it was truly major. Will it matter in 10 years? Almost certainly not. This 10-10-10 rule helps you calibrate appropriate emotional intensity to actual significance. The deathbed perspective asks, when you're 90 years old, looking back on your life, will you remember this moment? Will you wish you'd gotten angrier? Or will you wish you'd let it go and focused on what truly mattered? This isn't morbid, it's clarifying. It helps you distinguish between genuine priorities and ego reactions. Communication strategies become crucial when anger involves other people. You can do all the internal regulation work, but if you express yourself in ways that escalate conflict, the anger situation continues. Marshall Rosenberg's Nonviolent Communication, or NVC, provides a framework used by everyone from Microsoft to the United Nations for navigating difficult conversations. The NVC formula has 4 steps. First, observations without evaluation. State what you saw or heard without adding judgment or interpretation. Not "you're always late and inconsiderate," but "I noticed you arrived at 7:30 when we agreed on 7 door." Second, feelings. Express how you felt using actual emotion words. "I felt frustrated and worried," not "I felt like you don't care," which is a thought disguised as a feeling. Third, needs. Identify the universal human need beneath the feeling. I need reliability and to feel that our time together is valued. Fourth, requests. Make a specific, actionable request, not a demand. Would you be willing to text me if you're running late? A complete NVC statement might be, when I see dishes left in the sink overnight, I feel frustrated because I need order and shared responsibility in our home. Would you be willing to wash your dishes before bed? This formula transforms accusation into vulnerable sharing. Instead of attacking the other person's character, you're describing your experience and making a specific request. This de-escalates conflict because the other person doesn't feel attacked and can hear what you actually need. And crucially, it doesn't require suppressing your anger. You're acknowledging and expressing your frustration, but in a way that invites resolution rather than escalation. Active listening is the other half of effective communication. When the other person is speaking, truly listening rather than preparing your response diffuses anger on both sides. The core active listening skills include restating what you heard in similar words, paraphrasing in your own words to confirm understanding, reflecting the emotions you perceive, summarizing main points, and asking open-ended questions. The biggest mistakes in listening are interrupting, judging before they've finished, mentally preparing your response while they're talking, and offering unsolicited advice. Body language matters hugely. Maintain appropriate eye contact, nod to show you're engaged, keep an open posture, lean slightly forward, and maintain a neutral facial expression even if you disagree. I statements transform potentially inflammatory communication. Instead of "you never listen to me," try "I feel unheard when I'm speaking, and you're on your phone because I need to feel that my thoughts matter to you." The formula is simple. I feel emotion when situation because I need NED. I would like request. The shift from "you" statements that blame to "I" statements that share your experience changes everything. "You" statements put people on the defensive. They feel attacked and attack back. "I" statements are harder to argue with because you're simply describing your experience. The other person might not agree that your need should matter to them, but they can't deny that you feel what you feel. Setting boundaries without anger is absolutely crucial for long-term peace. Many people struggle with this because they've learned 2 modes. Doormat mode, where they accept anything to avoid conflict, or volcano mode, where they explode after tolerating too much. Neither works well. The third option is calm, clear boundary setting. A boundary is simply a line that communicates what's acceptable and what isn't in your interactions with others. I'm willing to discuss this when we're both calm. I'm not willing to be yelled at. I'm happy to help when I have capacity. I'm not available to drop everything every time you have a crisis. I enjoy spending time together when we're both respectful. I won't continue conversations when insults start. The key is clarity without justification. No is a complete sentence. You don't need to provide a dissertation defending your boundary. Over-explaining suggests you're not sure you have a right to the boundary, which invites negotiation. State the boundary clearly and simply, then stop talking. When people push back on your boundaries, use the broken record technique. Calmly repeat your boundary without elaborating or defending. I understand you're disappointed. I'm not available that day. I hear that you're upset. I'm still not going to continue this conversation while you're yelling. Just keep repeating the boundary until the other person realizes you won't be swayed. Practice these techniques individually at first. When you're not in an activated state, practice box breathing until it's automatic. Practice the stop technique with minor irritations, so it's available during major ones. Practice I statements in low-stakes situations so they flow naturally in high-stakes ones. Build the neural pathways during peace so they're available during war. Then practice chaining techniques together. When triggered, do a physiological sigh, then count to 6, then use the zoom-out perspective, then choose your response using NVC or an I statement. The combination is far more powerful than any single technique. You're interrupting the anger cascade at multiple points simultaneously. Track what works for you. Not everyone responds to the same techniques equally. Maybe box breathing does nothing for you, but the physiological sigh is magic. Maybe the timeline perspective helps you, while the cosmic zoom out feels silly. Experiment systematically and build your personal arsenal of go-to interventions that reliably work for your nervous system and cognitive style. And remember, the goal isn't perfection. You won't remember to use these techniques every time. You'll still have moments where anger sweeps you away before you implement anything. That's normal and expected. Progress isn't linear. What matters is the overall trajectory. Are you using these techniques more often this month than last month? Are your anger episodes shorter or less intense than before? That's success, even if you're not perfect. When reality hits, navigating anger in real-world situations. All the science and philosophy and techniques mean nothing if you can't apply them when your teenager slams their bedroom door, or your boss publicly criticizes your work, or your partner forgets something important for the 3rd time this month. Let's get specific about common anger triggering scenarios and exactly how to navigate them. Workplace anger is uniquely challenging because professional consequences constrain your responses. You can't rage at your boss without risking your job. You can't tell a difficult client exactly what you think of them. You have to maintain professional composure even when you're furious inside. This constraint is actually useful because it forces you to develop sophisticated emotional regulation skills. When a coworker takes credit for your work in a meeting, the automatic response is to call them out right there, possibly with some heat. But that approach, even if justified, creates a scene and makes you look unprofessional. The responsive approach starts with a physiological sigh the moment you realize what's happening. This interrupts the initial anger cascade. Next, use the 6-second rule. Count silently while they're talking. This keeps you from interrupting emotionally. While counting, employ the zoom-out perspective. In the grand scheme of my career, how much does this moment matter? This doesn't mean accepting the injustice, but it helps you respond strategically rather than react emotionally. After the meeting, request a private conversation with the person. Use an I statement. I felt frustrated when my ideas were presented as your ideas because I need recognition for my contributions and trust in our collaboration. Can we talk about how we present shared work? If they're defensive, use active listening. I hear that you don't see it the same way I do. Help me understand your perspective. Then restate your boundary clearly. Going forward, I need us to be clear about who contributed what. If the pattern continues, document instances and escalate appropriately through your organization's channels. But throughout the process, maintaining emotional control isn't about being weak or accepting mistreatment. It's about being strategic. Anger might feel powerful, but it reduces your options. Calm assertiveness actually achieves better results. Difficult bosses trigger anger by threatening your autonomy and competence. Maybe they micromanage. Maybe they're inconsistent in their feedback. Maybe they take out their stress on you. The Stoic dichotomy of control is essential here. You don't control your boss's behavior. management style, mood, or decisions. You do control your work quality, your professionalism, your boundaries, your job search, if it comes to that. When your boss unfairly criticizes your work, the immediate urge is to defend yourself, explain why you're right, or counterattack by pointing out their flaws. Resist all of these. Take a time out if possible. I'd like to think about this feedback. Can we continue this conversation this afternoon? If not possible, use the stop technique internally while they're talking. After they finish, restate what you heard to ensure understanding. What I hear you saying is that you want the report to include more detail on the financial projections. Is that correct? This active listening serves multiple purposes. It ensures you actually understand the criticism, which might be valid even if delivered poorly. It shows respect, which reduces their defensiveness, and it gives you time to process your anger rather than reacting. If the criticism is legitimate, acknowledge it without over-apologizing. You're right that this section needs more detail. I'll revise it and have it to you by tomorrow. If you disagree, express that respectfully. I appreciate the feedback. I chose this level of detail because my understanding was that the audience prefers high-level summaries. Can you help me understand what level of detail you're looking for? Document interactions with difficult bosses, not to build a case against them necessarily, but because documentation helps you see patterns objectively. Is every interaction negative or just some? Are there specific triggers you can predict and prepare for? Are their criticisms consistent or contradictory? This objective analysis prevents you from being swept into emotional narratives. And remember your options. You're not trapped. You can initiate difficult conversations about the working relationship. You can request a transfer to a different manager. You can look for opportunities elsewhere. Having options reduces the feeling of powerlessness that amplifies anger, even if you don't exercise those options immediately. Knowing they exist creates breathing room. Family conflicts carry the weight of history, attachment, and often unresolved wounds from childhood. When your mother criticizes your parenting, she might be triggering emotional flashbacks to childhood when you felt you could never meet her standards. The anger you feel isn't just about her comment today. It's about every criticism you've absorbed over decades. Recognizing this pattern doesn't mean dismissing the current situation, but it helps you respond to what's actually happening rather than reacting to accumulated pain. Use the RAIN technique. Recognize the anger arising. Allow it to be present without immediately acting. Investigate what's beneath it with curiosity. What old wound is this touching? Nurture yourself with compassion. This is genuinely difficult. It makes sense that you'd feel angry. When you're ready to respond, set a clear boundary using an I statement. Mom, I appreciate that you care about my kids. I've made decisions about parenting that work for my family. I need you to trust that I'm handling things appropriately. If she pushes back, use the broken record technique. I understand you disagree. I've made my decision. I hear your concerns. My answer is still the same. If she continues, you might need a firmer boundary. If you continue to criticize my parenting, I'll need to end our visit. And crucially, follow through if the boundary is crossed. As I said, I'm not willing to discuss this further. I'm going to head home now. Boundaries without enforcement aren't boundaries, they're suggestions. With adult children who don't call as often as you'd like, notice the unmet expectation driving your anger. You expected a certain level of contact. Reality doesn't match. The anger is signaling that gap. But your adult children have their own lives, responsibilities, relationships. The solution isn't getting angrier to force compliance. The solution is adjusting your expectations to reality or making a clear request. I'd love to connect with you more regularly. Would you be willing to have a weekly call on Sundays? Intimate partnerships require balancing vulnerability and boundary setting. When your partner forgets your anniversary, the reactive response is cold withdrawal or passive-aggressive comments. The responsive approach acknowledges the layered emotions: hurt that something important to you wasn't remembered, fear about what this might mean for the relationship, sadness that this special day isn't special. Using the tender self-compassion practice, acknowledge your hurt. This really hurts. It's okay to feel disappointed. Then apply fierce self-compassion by asking for what you need. I felt really hurt when you forgot our anniversary because celebrations of our relationship matter deeply to me. I need to feel like we're a priority to each other. Can we talk about ways to make sure important dates are remembered? The phrasing is crucial. Not "you forgot because you don't care." That's mind reading and accusation. Instead, "I felt hurt" describes your experience, and "I need" states your need. This vulnerable sharing is more likely to create connection and problem solving than angry accusations. Criticism and rejection trigger ego defenses. When someone criticizes your work, your parenting, your appearance, your choices, the ego immediately feels threatened. The defensive anger that rises is protecting your self-concept from information that challenges it. The key is distinguishing between useful feedback and attacks on your worth. Ask yourself, is there any truth in this criticism that could help me grow? You don't have to accept the criticism wholesale. Maybe the person delivering it has poor motives or poor delivery, but is there a kernel of truth you can extract and use? This isn't about being a doormat. It's about mining every experience for useful information. If the criticism is genuinely just an attack, the most powerful response is often calm indifference. I appreciate you sharing your perspective with no further engagement. You don't need to defend yourself against every criticism. You don't need everyone to see you accurately. The people whose opinions actually matter to you get your attention and response. Random critics get neutral acknowledgement and nothing more. Disrespect and provocation test whether you're driven by ego or values. Someone insults you. Your ego wants to insult them back, to win the exchange, to prove you're not someone who can be disrespected. But what do you actually value? Do you value being the kind of person who responds to disrespect with more disrespect? Or do you value being the kind of person who remains calm and dignified regardless of how others behave? The stop technique here gives you the pause to check in with your values. What would my best self do in this situation? Maybe your best self would calmly name the pattern. I notice you're being insulting. I'm not sure what you're hoping to accomplish, but I'm not going to engage with insults. Maybe your best self would simply walk away without any response, refusing to participate in the game. Passive-aggressive behavior creates particular frustration because it's indirect hostility that's hard to address. "Oh, I thought you'd be too busy for us," in response to declining an invitation. Interesting choice when you share news. Whatever you think is best in a tone that clearly communicates disagreement. The anger you feel is about the hidden attack you can sense but can't quite pin down. The response is naming the pattern directly, but without accusation. I notice that when you say whatever you think is best, your tone suggests you disagree. I'd rather hear your actual opinion so we can have a real conversation. Or when you make comments like "interesting choice," I'm not sure if you're being supportive or critical. Can you be more direct about what you mean? This puts the indirectness on the table without getting sucked into the passive-aggressive dynamic. If they claim they're being sincere, take them at face value. Great, I appreciate your support. If they admit disagreement, you can have the actual conversation. I'm glad you're being direct now. Help me understand your concerns. High-pressure situations, like tight deadlines, public speaking, or crisis management, are when anger often erupts because stress lowers your threshold. The preventive approach is stress inoculation training, deliberately practicing stress regulation in lower-stakes situations so the skills are automatic when stakes are high. Before a high-pressure event, use the 4-7-8 breathing to put your nervous system in a calm baseline state. During the event, use your breath as an anchor. When you feel stress rising, Take one physiological sigh. Nobody will notice, but it will shift your state. Use the zoom-out perspective. Is anyone's life actually in danger? Will this matter in a year? After high-stress events, intentionally discharge the stress rather than carrying it into your evening or next interaction. This might mean a brief workout, a walk, progressive muscle relaxation, or just allowing yourself to shake or move to release the tension. Don't immediately jump to the next thing while still physiologically activated. In all of these scenarios, the pattern is the same. Recognize what's happening internally before responding externally. Use techniques to regulate your physiology and create space for prefrontal cortex engagement. Respond strategically based on your values rather than reacting automatically from anger. Learn from each situation to handle it better next time. This isn't about perfection in the moment. It's about the trajectory of growth over time. The ultimate transformation. Becoming someone who rarely gets angry. Everything we've covered so far works. The neuroscience explains the mechanisms. The psychology reveals the hidden dynamics. The ancient wisdom provides tested frameworks. The practical techniques give you immediate tools. And the real-world application shows you how to use all of it in actual life. But there's a difference between managing anger and transforming your relationship with it at the identity level. Managing means you still get angry regularly. You just handle it better. Transformation means you become someone for whom anger rarely arises in the first place. The situations that used to trigger you simply don't trigger you anymore. You've changed at a fundamental level. This identity level change is the difference between behavior modification and genuine transformation. Behavior modification uses willpower to control actions. I'm angry, but I won't express it. Transformation changes the underlying patterns, so the anger doesn't arise with the same intensity or frequency. The situation doesn't make me angry because I interpret it differently now. Dan McAdam's research on narrative identity shows that your sense of self is constructed through the story you tell about who you are. This narrative identity provides your life with purpose and unity. It answers the questions, who am I? What matters to me? Where am I going? And crucially, narratives can be edited. You can change your story while respecting the facts of your life. Most people who struggle with anger have a narrative that explains it. I'm hot-tempered. I come from a family of hot-tempered people. I'm passionate and intense. I care deeply, so I react strongly. I don't take disrespect from anyone. These stories feel like descriptions of fixed traits, but they're actually narratives that can be rewritten. The new narrative doesn't deny the past, but interprets it differently and creates a different future. I used to be quick to anger because I hadn't learned emotional regulation skills. I'm developing those skills now and becoming someone who responds thoughtfully. This narrative acknowledges the past, identifies you as someone actively growing, and orients toward a different future. James Clear's work on identity-based habits shows that linking behaviors to identity creates lasting change. Instead of, I want to manage my anger better, which keeps anger as a problem you have, shift to, I am someone who practices emotional mastery, which makes the practice part of who you are. Every time you choose a calm response, you're casting a vote for this identity. Enough votes and the election is won. This identity becomes who you are. Building emotional resilience provides the foundation for transformation. Resilience isn't toughness or suppression. It's flexibility and recovery. Resilient people experience difficult emotions, but bounce back quickly, rather than getting stuck in them. Research identifies several factors that build resilience. Positive emotions aren't just the absence of negative emotions. They're a resource that broadens your thinking and builds psychological reserves. Deliberately cultivating positive emotions through gratitude practices, savoring good moments, connecting with others, and engaging in meaningful activities creates a buffer against stress. Cognitive flexibility means you can shift perspectives, consider alternatives, and adapt your thinking when circumstances change. Rigid thinking amplifies anger. This should not be happening. This is unacceptable. Flexible thinking allows. This isn't what I wanted, but it's what's happening. What are my options given this reality? Social support provides crucial emotional and practical resources. People connected to supportive relationships regulate emotions better, recover from stress faster, and maintain well-being more consistently than isolated individuals. Building and maintaining these connections is essential infrastructure for emotional health. Meaning and purpose in life. Create resilience by providing a why that sustains you through difficulties. When actions align with deeply held values, challenges become meaningful struggles rather than meaningless suffering. Clarifying what matters most to you gives context for daily frustrations that prevents them from feeling overwhelming. Active coping involves engaging with problems rather than avoiding them. This doesn't mean you can solve every problem, but it means you take the actions available to you rather than feeling helpless. Even small actions create a sense of agency that reduces the helplessness that often underlies chronic anger. Mindfulness and meditation create the most direct brain changes, supporting emotional transformation. Systematic reviews of research show that 8 weeks of regular meditation produces measurable increases in gray matter in the prefrontal cortex, hippocampus, and insula, regions involved in attention, emotion regulation, and self-awareness. At the same time, the amygdala shows decreased volume and reduced reactivity. But brain structure changes are just the beginning. Long-term meditators, people with 10,000 plus hours of practice, show trait-level alterations in emotional processing. Their default mode network, the brain network active when not focused on external tasks, shows different patterns. They spend less time in self-referential rumination and more time in present moment awareness. The metacognitive awareness they develop during meditation becomes a stable feature of how they experience life. You don't need 10,000 hours to see benefits. Studies show measurable changes within 8 weeks of daily practice. 20 minutes per day is sufficient for most people to begin experiencing shifts. The key is consistency over intensity. Daily practice, even if brief, builds neural pathways that transform your default responses. Self-compassion practice complements meditation by changing how you relate to yourself when you do experience difficult emotions or make mistakes. Kristin Neff's research defines self-compassion as having 3 components: self-kindness versus self-judgment, recognizing common humanity versus feeling isolated in your struggles, and mindfulness versus over-identification with difficult experiences. When you get angry and then get angry at yourself for getting angry, you're doubling your suffering. The anger creates pain, and your self-criticism creates additional pain about the pain. Self-compassion interrupts this cycle. You can acknowledge, I got angry. That wasn't my best self, and it's okay. I'm human. I'm learning. What can I do differently next time? This isn't self-indulgence or making excuses. It's treating yourself with the same kindness you'd offer a good friend who's struggling. Research shows that self-compassionate people actually hold themselves to high standards and work toward their goals effectively. But they do so from a foundation of self-acceptance rather than self-attack. This foundation makes the journey sustainable. Values clarification ensures your emotional regulation serves meaningful purposes. Self-determination theory identifies 3 fundamental psychological needs: autonomy, the sense that you're choosing your actions; competence, feeling effective at what you do; and relatedness, connection with others. When your life satisfies these needs, you experience intrinsic motivation and well-being. When these needs are thwarted, you experience distress. Applied to anger transformation. This means asking, why does emotional mastery matter to me? Not why it should matter, not why other people think it should matter, but why it matters to you personally. Maybe because you want to model emotional regulation for your children. Maybe because you value the kind of relationships that emotional mastery enables. Maybe because you're tired of feeling controlled by your emotions and want freedom. Whatever your why, connecting to it daily provides motivation that willpower alone can't sustain. Create a sustainable daily practice by stacking small habits rather than attempting dramatic overhauls. 5 minutes of morning meditation, anchored to getting out of bed. Using the stop technique when you notice stress during the day, anchored to physical sensations of tension. 5 minutes of reflection before sleep, anchored to getting into bed. These small practices done consistently create massive compounding results. Track your progress by focusing on leading indicators, the actions you're taking, rather than just lagging indicators, the outcomes you're getting. Did you meditate today? Did you use breathing techniques when triggered? Did you pause before responding in a difficult conversation? These are the metrics that matter because they're fully within your control and they're what create the outcomes. Dealing with setbacks through self-compassion determines whether a temporary lapse becomes a lasting regression. You will have moments where anger hijacks you. You will say things you regret. You will react automatically, despite all your practice. This is part of the process, not evidence that the process doesn't work. When setbacks happen, the self-critical response is, I failed. I'm not making progress. I'll never change. I'm just an angry person. This narrative creates shame, and shame creates hopelessness, and hopelessness derails all effort. The self-compassionate response is, I got swept into anger today. That's disappointing, and it's also understandable given the circumstances and my nervous system history. What did I learn? What will I try differently next time? I'm committed to this path, regardless of occasional setbacks. Research shows that self-compassionate people actually recover from setbacks faster and persist toward goals more effectively than self-critical people. The self-criticism feels like it should motivate improvement, but actually undermines it. The self-compassion feels like it might enable complacency, but actually enables growth. Long-term maintenance requires designing your life to support your transformation rather than relying solely on individual willpower. Environmental design principles show that small changes to your environment can dramatically affect behavior. If anger is often triggered by stress, what life changes reduce chronic stress? If anger is triggered by specific people or situations, what boundaries or changes minimize that exposure? This isn't avoidance of life's challenges. It's strategic design of your life to support who you're becoming. You might choose to spend less time with people who consistently trigger your worst self, and more time with people who bring out your best self. You might leave a job that's chronically stressful for one that better aligns with your values. You might change your media consumption habits if certain content consistently leaves you enraged. The transformation from someone who struggles with anger to someone who embodies calm is like any developmental process. It happens in stages, with periods of rapid progress and plateaus where progress isn't visible, but foundations are being built. The timeline typically unfolds over months. Initial changes happen within days to weeks. As you learn and start applying new techniques, you notice you're catching yourself sooner. You're using tools you didn't have before. The anger still arises, but you're not completely at its mercy. Habit automaticity develops within 2 to 3 months on average. The techniques that initially required conscious effort start happening more automatically. You reach for the physiological sigh without thinking about it. The stop technique becomes natural. Brain structural changes become visible after about 8 weeks of consistent practice, as shown in meditation studies. This is when the prefrontal cortex thickening and amygdala volume reduction start happening. The changes are still fragile, but they're real. Trait changes typically emerge within 3 to 6 months. This is when people around you start noticing you're different. Situations that used to reliably trigger you don't anymore. Your default response patterns have shifted. The new ways of being are becoming genuinely you, not just techniques you apply. Identity-level transformation generally takes 6 to 12 months with consistent practice. This is when you genuinely become a different person. The old narratives no longer fit. When you think about who you are, the angry person isn't how you see yourself anymore. You've evolved. Mastery is a lifelong process. Even people with decades of practice continue deepening and refining. But the good news is, you don't need mastery to experience dramatic improvements in your life. The transformation at the 6 to 12 month mark is usually sufficient to create the peace and freedom you're seeking. Everything after that is refinement. The most important thing to understand is that this transformation is available to you. Not because you're special or chosen, but because you're human, and this is how human nervous systems and psychologies work. The principles are universal. The techniques are proven. The path is clear. The only question is whether you'll walk it. And you don't walk it alone. You're joining millions of people throughout history who've made this journey. You're standing on shoulders of ancient philosophers and modern scientists who've mapped the territory. You're supported by wisdom traditions and therapeutic approaches that provide tested methods. The tools are in your hands. The choice is yours. And the person you're becoming is waiting. Your journey begins now. You've just absorbed a comprehensive guide to emotional transformation. Thousands of words backed by neuroscience, psychology, ancient wisdom, and practical application. But knowledge alone changes nothing. Action changes everything. The person who never gets angry isn't born that way. They're built through daily choices, consistent practice, and unwavering commitment to growth. Every time you pause before reacting, you're building new neural pathways. Every time you choose a calm response over an automatic explosion, you're casting a vote for the person you're becoming. Every time you use these techniques instead of letting anger control you, you're proving to yourself that transformation is real. Start today, not tomorrow, not next week. Right now, commit to one small practice. Maybe it's 5 minutes of morning meditation. Maybe it's using the physiological sigh when you feel triggered. Maybe it's practicing the stop technique during your commute. One small habit, done consistently, creates the foundation for everything else. Remember, the anger you feel isn't you. It's a neurological process, a psychological pattern, a learned response. And what's been learned can be unlearned. What's been wired can be rewired. The brain you have today doesn't have to be the brain you have 6 months from now. You don't need to be perfect. You need to be persistent. You don't need to never feel angry again. You need to change your relationship with anger so it informs you rather than controls you. You don't need dramatic transformation overnight. You need small improvements compounded over time. The path is clear. The tools are in your hands. The science guarantees that consistent practice creates results. The only question remaining is whether you'll walk this path, whether you'll choose growth over comfort, whether you'll invest in becoming the person you want to be. That person, calm and centered and free from reactive anger, already exists within you. They're not some distant ideal. They're the natural expression of your nervous system when properly trained, your psychology when properly understood, your spirit when properly nurtured. 6 months from now, you can be someone who barely recognizes the person reading this now. Someone who handles stress with grace. Someone who navigates conflict with skill. Someone who responds to provocation with dignity. Someone who lives in peace. The journey begins with a single step. Take that step today. If this guide has helped you, if you've gained insights or tools that matter, help others find it too. Like this video so more people discover these life-changing principles. Subscribe to this channel for more content on emotional mastery, psychological growth, and practical wisdom for modern life. Share this with someone who struggles with anger. Your transformation inspires others. Your growth creates ripples. Thank you for investing this time in yourself. Thank you for believing that change is possible. Thank you for being willing to do the work. You deserve the peace that comes from emotional mastery. And now you have the map to find it. The rest is up to you.